Hi, I'm Keith Cotter and welcome to the HSB Academy tutorial session. In this session we're going to learn how to create roof details. You're going to learn how to set up a framing style for a roof, and in that roof you're going to determine how all the joists in the roof, all the sheeting is laid out, and then essentially move on then to how each of these components are connected together. So be it on a ridge, a hip or a valley, or even how a wall underneath is connected to a roof. So let's jump in, let's take a look and see how this is done. So here in front of me I have a roof that I would have covered out in a previous session on how to frame a roof. And if you haven't seen that, I probably would suggest you should look at that particular video first of all before attempting to do the detailed framing that we're doing next. So in order to create any of the details for our roof, we first of all need to go to the roof element ribbon and then go to framing styles editor. For the purposes of setting up a framing style for this roof, I'm now going to use the default beam and the default sheet that's given already with hsbDesign. Of course, you can create your own inventory by creating additional family sheets and beams, something which I have covered in an earlier session in stick framing for walls. So again, if you want to understand how I set up inventory, I suggest you take a look at the stick framing for walls that I had covered off previously. So for now, what we're going to do is we're going to head to the framing style and we're going to add a new group, and the group that we're going to add here is a wall, because I do have a wall in question, and I'm going to keep this very simple and leave it as it is. That is the wall framing style. I'm leaving everything as default on my wall framing style for now, because we're going to create a knee wall that will be under our roof as well. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a new group, but this time in the drop down we want to switch to a roof, and we're now going to add that framing style, which is a new roof, and here we could call this maybe roof in this case. Now we're going to go into the zone. So here we have our zones, and zone 0 is always considered the structural zone of the roof. And in this case I'm using a 200, and that 200 is taken from the default beam that we have in the inventory in this case. And you can see these are all the parameters related to how that beam is set out, or that those beams are set out in the roof. So at the moment you can see it's currently justifying from left to right, where you see the start distribution is left. I could switch that to right and you can see it adjusts slightly in the preview as well. So what we also want to do is we want to add some sheeting on top. Now the sheeting on top that we're going to add is probably battens in this case. So I'm going to change that to batten, and maybe I'm going to use a 40 mil thickness for the batten, and you can begin to see that this will start to build down here. And over here for the width of my batten I'm going to say is 50, and you can see it's now adjusting here. But notice how the battens aren't aligned with the top of the joist. That's because the rely on means it needs to rely on the zone underneath. So I'm going to tell it to rely under that zone, and you can now see it adjusts in this case. Battens have what I would call an unlimited length, so I'm just going to make that 10,000, knowing that my roof won't exceed a length of 10,000 in this particular case. What we're also going to do is we're going to add a sheet underneath, and I'm going to simply leave that as a 10 mil sheet, and hence we get that type of result here. And I'm also going to have that rely on zone 0 as well. So that's purely a zone that's 1200 by 2400 roughly in its configuration. So that's really the default bounding area of the roof element. What we can also then do is define the edge details, and you can see that this is a roof here, and you can see that's one edge of the roof, that's another edge of the roof, that's the side, and so on. So for example, I could say on this side detail, I want to add a detail. I'm going to call it maybe a side detail, and in here what I can do is I'm going to add an additional beam. Okay, so the side detail, and this will now get 2 beams as opposed to 1, and you can see already here on the preview it's already creating 2 beams. And likewise, I might say over here I want this also to have 2 beams, and you can now see it is with 2 beams over here. So that's the edge detailing, and whenever you want to define the edge detail around the roof element and what it is, you should be changing the details here. But of course we know that roof elements have connection, and this is where it starts to get really interesting now, because we're moving into the connections field. And those of you that may have seen before my previous videos on walls would have noted that it only ever had this box here, but now this has begun to really grow in connection types, and you can now see the new connections that are added is roof to roof and wall to roof. And we're going to now focus first of all on this roof connection, and we're going to create a ridge detail very similar to this one here. And you'll see here I'm using 2 beams, and I have stretched back also the core zone so that it would stop on the ridge beam. So we're going to create that detail here now. So here in the details I have a default, and I'm just going to use the default in this case. Of course I could go and create a new detail, but for now I'm going to use the default and edit it in this particular case. So what we want to do is, the first thing I do, you can either select the beam to be added to this side or this side depending on where you want it to be, and I'm going to add beam. But before I add a beam, one of the suggestions that I would now make is, this is a true 45-degree roof. What about if we had a roof that was 45 on this case and a different angle on this case? We want to be able to see what the result would be in an angle like this. So what I always propose you to do here is, on this additional rotation I would put in here something like 10. I would make it off so that it's not the same angle on both sides. So on this side I want to now add a beam, and this is a tool here where I can rotate the beam and move it into position and snap it, and you'll notice it snaps automatically when it finds a connection with these points here. Okay, and you can see it automatically found that line. So once again, let's just do that. So you can see as I approach it, it'll automatically see it and snap. Now once it aligns to the outline here and to this, you'll see I'm with anchors, and you can also see that the beam is currently showing me an exclamation mark. That means it's not anchored. You cannot continue on or finish this detail unless you anchor the beam. And in this case I'm going to anchor this beam to that edge, and this edge here, it is now locked in. Next thing I want to do is I want to add another beam here, and in the same way I'm going to say this beam goes to here, and we're going to anchor that here, and I'm going to say this anchors to this and that anchors to that. So what do we need to do next? The next thing we need to do is take care of the sheeting. So how do we take care of that sheeting? Well, what we want to really do is we want the sheeting to probably stop at this point here. Okay, and if I select the sheeting right now and try and move it back, you'll notice that it has nowhere to reference where to lock into, and that's always very important. Whereas here you can see I'm automatically with the anchors. So in reality what I need is I need one of these points here, and we can do that by using the auxiliary geometry. And down here you can see I can get an intersection point where I can essentially find this reference plane and find this reference plane, which is the edge of the beam, and you can see it now finds this particular edge here. Now if I select this particular sheet and drag it back, you'll now see it'll snap to that particular point. So in order to fix the rest of the sheet, I do need to have points here. I'll probably need to have a point here and here. And we do that using the auxiliary geometry. So let me do that now. Off I go. So I highlight this edge, highlight that edge, and then I go once more, intersection edge, I highlight this and that, and finally I come down here and do one more, just this edge and that edge. So now we can go and pick this, and I can lock this in here. The sheeting down here I can lock back again to here, and this sheet I can lock back to here. So now we are with our sheeting tied back, and the only thing that we have left to do is the structural zone, which is zone 0, is currently coming right up and protruding into these beams, whereas I need it to stop at this particular point here. So what we need to do is define the core layer, and I define the core layer by saying it's going to stop here, and you'll notice it steps back to that point. And finally I say define the core layer here. Oh, my apologies, that's incorrect. So once more to that, then we highlight this and say define the core layer here and do this. So if I change that back to 0, you can see everything will adjust accordingly to it, and it's all lined up. So that's our ridge detail defined, and what we're now going to do is say OK to this, and we've defined our ridge detail. So next up is our wall to roof connection, and this will be for the knee wall, and you can see from the detail below that this is a connection where the wall connects to the underside of the roof, and I'm going to create a milling detail that will almost create like a stop beam that will sit into this milling detail. We're going to learn how we set that particular detail up. So to do that, we need to use the wall and roof section here, and we're going to use this particular detail in here. So I'm going to use that default detail and edit. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to add the beam into this wall, because I want to create a double beam. I want to create another beam under here. So we go up here and we add a beam. It puts it on top of the other beam, so I'm going to move it down and set it in this location. And whenever you see this exclamation mark, it means that the beam has not been anchored correctly, so I need to anchor it to that particular section here. Okay, the next section that we're going to look at is the roof in this case, and this beam here is a default beam that has been put in, and that's going to run the full length of the roof perpendicular to the run of the joist. Now, if I leave that beam in here, it's obviously clearly going to clash through the beams. So the type of beam that I want to put in here is really a blocking type beam. So what we want to do in reality is replace this beam with what we call a blocking beam. And to do that, you add a blocking beam, which is this guy here. So I'm going to remove him now and delete, and what I'm going to do is move it in until it snaps to this line, as you can see here, and lock it in. So now this is called a blocking beam. Now I tend to start getting into the habit at this stage of really labeling these beams here. So I'm going to call this BL for blocking code. This will be useful at a later stage, because you can control the extent of how this beam runs along the wall, whether it runs beyond the actual wall or stops short of the wall as such. But more on that later. So the next thing that I want to do now is I want to add a beam, and I want to place this beam more or less in the center of this wall here. And like I've said before, what we want to do is I'm going to lock it into the center of that and onto that. So I've gotten rid of my exclamation mark in this case. So over here on this particular beam, maybe I'm going to say this is going to be called MB for milling beam, because this is the beam that we want to mill out in this particular case. So what we want to do now is we need to create the scenario where it cuts out the milling area on that particular beam. To do that, what I need is 2 additional points. I need this point and I also need that point here. And to do that, we use again our auxiliary geometry, which we learned in the ridge detail, and an intersection point. And I'm going to say I want to create an intersection point with this edge and that edge, puts in a point, and I want to once more do another intersection point, and let's get this here and here, and you can now see it creates that edge. So we want to add the milling to this particular beam, so I highlight it and I go add milling now. So this will now add the milling, and I'm going to rotate that particular milling tool and I'm going to move it in until it snaps to the axis. And right now you can see I have that exclamation mark, so I'm going to say I'm going to lock it into that and lock it into this, and it now creates that milling cutout that we have here in the beam. We do have a situation up here where the beam is sticking out a little bit from the edge, so we probably want to add a cut on that particular beam. So I'm going to highlight that beam, go up here and go add cut and say I want to add a cut along this face, and the cut is going to take away the AA from this particular beam, so it cuts away this part of the beam in itself. So then what we need to do also is the studs that will be in this wall that are coming up on this wall, we need to control where they go. Right now that's the grey bounding area, or this area that I've highlighted here, the yellow area, and that is currently extending all the way up to here and down to here. But we can control that by defining the core layer, and I'm going to tell this core layer it needs to stop here, and you can immediately see it stops it here. So in reality the cut that I've just put in here is now really not needed, because you really don't need to cut this because there's no actual stud wall happening here. So in reality I could, if I wanted to, remove that cut once more from the area. So all we have left now to do is one last step, and that is this particular sheet here is currently running right through into this beam and out the other side. And what I want to do is I want to cut back that sheet maybe to these 2 points here. You could obviously add additional points as well if you wanted to control it, or I could even add an offset line from an edge here and control how I want it to be, how far away I want the offset line. But I'm going to keep this quite simple, and I'm going to add a sheet cut to this particular beam and to this particular sheet, and we're going to say I'm going to add a sheet cut here and anchor it into that, and I'm going to add a sheet cut here and anchor it into this and pick the sheet in question. So important that you anchor it in, and when you've anchored it in you pick the actual sheet to complete the process. So in reality this is now our knee wall connection, all is good. We can now say OK to this, and we have now created the result that we require. So we can now say OK and return back to our model drawing. So we're ready now to frame our roof, so I'm going to turn it into wireframe. These symbols that you see here are the updated connections, where you can actually update your connections from here. It gives you the possibilities to be able to change the detail type. So this is the connection between the wall and the roof, and up here you can see it's using the default connection I set up, but if I had multiple other types set up, I could select it from here and it would use that detail in essence from here. But for now, we're just going to simply generate, and I'm going to select all of my model and finish. And our roof is framed. I'm going to just turn it back into shading mode. I'm just going to go back to visibility graphics here and turn off my wall, turn off my roofs. I'm going to say OK. And as we start to study our roof, first of all we have our ridge detail as we define. Inside here we have the beam that we put in across the roof. We also can control the height of these studs. That was defining the core layer. There's my beam that we had with the milling cut out. And last but not least, you can see the sheeting is all cut back as well from the beams, and the blocking beams between the joists are placed as well. So what we've now just done is successfully completed adding a ridge detail and the connection between the wall, but there are multiple other possibilities like doing valley details and hip detail to allow you to complete the full framing of this roof. I'm Keith Cotter, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in future sessions.